My name is Idil Boran, and I am an associate professor of philosophy at York University, and I serve as the associate director of CIFAL York. I am now very pleased to open this session from my desk at York University. And at York University, we acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. And with this, I welcome our moderator, our speakers, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. And for those who may not be familiar with CIFAL York, our center was established in 2020 and started its operations in 2021. CIFAL York was created in collaboration between the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, and York University with York Region to develop and deliver training and knowledge sharing as well as capacity building programs across 5 focus areas, which are disaster and emergency management, health and environment, entrepreneurship and economic development, equity, diversity and inclusion, and promoting sustainable development goals. This speaker series brings together speakers from academia, public, private sectors, as well as NGOs, with expertise, experience, and research in equity, diversity, and inclusion in disaster emergency management. And the speakers, their presentations will span across all CIFAL York focusing areas throughout the duration of the speaker series, which will run until the end of November. So then, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Saptarishi Bandopadhyay. Saptarishi, welcome to this seminar, and thank you for kindly agreeing to serve as a moderator. You are an assistant professor at Osgoode Hall Law School here at York University, and you hold a doctorate from Harvard University, master's degrees from Harvard Law School and the American University, with formal legal training at the National University of Juridical Sciences in India. Your first book, All Is Well, Catastrophe and the Making of the Normal State, was just published very recently, still hot off the press, by Oxford University Press. You studied and worked in disaster management in central India, in the borderlands between India, Pakistan, and China, and in the Philippines. You trained and advised officials and civil society in India, Thailand, Canada, and the United Nations, and published widely on disaster risk, international law, and related areas with multiple prestigious fellowships. Saptarishi, it is just fantastic to have you with us today to serve as moderator. And then without further ado, let me give you the floor to start this exciting panel, and with my thanks. Saptarishi, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Adil, and thanks for the introduction, but I've been wondering why I haven't been included in any CIFAL activities before. So I'm extremely glad to be here, and I'm really excited about this. Equity, diversity, inclusion in disaster and emergency management is an extremely important and deeply an extraordinarily important thing in the way in which we structure society and prepare for and mitigate disasters. So I'm very, very happy to be moderating this. And our speakers for today, who I'll introduce in just a moment, are eminently qualified to talk about this. So just very quickly, first of all, we have Ben Gallagher. Ben is an emergency management specialist for the city of Mississauga, where he has worked for the past 4 years. He holds a master's degree in public safety from Wilfrid Laurier University. as well as honors bachelor's degrees in disaster and emergency management from York University. And Ben will be talking to us about community-driven resilience, empowering diverse communities to drive disaster resilience. And our second speaker for today is Linnea Warren May. Linnea is an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. She has worked on projects related to building a culture of health, city and urban resilience, integrated data to assess well-being and social equity, and over the course of this and many other projects has partnered with the government and non-government stakeholders to use data analysis for decision-making. Before working for RAND, Linnea worked in tobacco policy and community engagement for HIV prevention. She holds a Master of Public Health, I'm going to say, the MPH, from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a concentration in health behavior, and also holds a BS in biology and psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. And Linnea will be taking us through measuring equity in the context of disaster resilience and response. The one thing I will say before I hand it over to Ben is that please do, people in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function as Ben and Linnea are speaking. As when possible, I will collect some of the questions to ask during the Q&A after the talks are done. However, in the meantime, if either of the speakers would like to respond on chat, you're more than welcome to do so. So with that, I will hand it over to Ben Gallagher. Thanks very much, Ben.
Perfect, thank you. Just give me a minute here to share my screen and confirm it's working. All right, perfect. So everyone can see that okay and hear me okay? All right, perfect. So hello, everyone. Before I begin, I'd just like to say a big thank you to CIFAL York for having me today. I'm very excited to be able to speak with all of you today on something that I am incredibly enthusiastic about and something that I get to be a part of every day in my job as an emergency manager. And I should just quickly say that while I'm going to be sharing examples with you of some of my experiences working municipal emergency management, all of these thoughts and experiences are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer and the organization I work for. That said, my name is Ben Gallagher, and I currently work as an emergency management specialist for the city of Mississauga, located in Ontario, Canada. And today I want to share with you some of the experiences that I've had with diversity, equity, and inclusion while working in the field of emergency management. But first, I think it's important that I acknowledge that I am greatly aware as I'm talking to you today about diversity, equity, inclusion, that I am a 30-year-old English-speaking white male who has lived in Canada my entire life. I very much grew up in a homogeneous bubble where the vast majority of the people I was surrounded by for most of my life looked similar to me, generally thought the same as me, and had very similar perceptions, expectations, and beliefs about life. And I think now, as an emergency manager, I've found myself in a professional bubble as well. As emergency managers in Ontario, we all go to the same conferences, we attend the same sector meetings, and now for those of us who've entered the field within the last 10 years or so, many of us have gone through the same university programs, and I use the plural of programs generously. And being someone who grew up and continues to live in a bubble does not serve me well in my job. As mentioned, I work for the city of Mississauga. Mississauga is a large city with a population of just under 720,000 people, and over half of the population identify as being a member of a visible minority. The city is made up of large communities of people with different ethnic origins, including large Indian, Chinese, Polish, Pakistani, Filipino, and other populations who are spread out throughout all areas of the city. The city is also very language diverse, with around exactly half of the respondents to the 2021 Canadian census identifying that their mother tongue is not one of Canada's 2 official languages. The city is religiously diverse with large populations of Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, and other religions. And the people in Mississauga have diverse levels of income, with approximately 9.4% of the population considered to be low income earners, which is slightly below the national rate. And these are just some of the indicators of diversity in the city, not to mention other very important diversity considerations related to age, gender, persons living with disabilities, etc. So as someone who lives in a personal and professional bubble, when I first started working in the field, I thought that it was my job to ensure that I was able to tell communities the things that they needed to do to be resilient against disasters. I thought the best way to do this was to repeat the same emergency preparedness messaging that I'd always heard. You're probably very familiar with this messaging, or at least some iteration of it. Have a plan, build a kit, stay informed. If you go onto the Public Safety Canada website or the Emergency Management Ontario website and are trying to figure out how to be prepared for emergencies, these are the key points you're going to find. And of course, this information then trickles down to the municipalities at the local level. Across Ontario, during every emergency preparedness week in May, you're guaranteed to see municipalities from across the province and the country regurgitating this messaging with pamphlets and posters, posting it on social media and their websites, and talking to residents about the importance of these 3 key steps. And as a new green emergency manager, I followed suit and did the same. However, early into my career, I had a few epiphany moments, which is a nicer way of saying I had a bunch of wow, I feel really dumb moments. So the first of these moments came several years ago when my former manager and I met with the CEO of the Mississauga Food Bank. We connected with the food bank to try to get some of our emergency preparedness messaging out to some of their clients. We'd ordered 5,000 of our emergency preparedness guide booklets, and we're planning on including a copy of the guide in each of the care packages that the beneficiaries of the food bank received. As we were explaining this to the CEO, she asked us, do these guides have anything in them about emergency kits? We told her that they in fact did include information on emergency kits, knowing in our heads that not only was it included, but it was the cornerstone of the messaging contained within these guides. The CEO then said to us, we really try not to include any information on emergency kits because the people we serve really can't afford this stuff. It was in this moment that I became very aware of the bubble I was living and working in. As the supposed expert on emergency preparedness, here I was trying to tell people who struggle to afford food on a daily basis that they should have always at least 3 days worth of food and water, not to mention a flashlight, a crank radio, and a whole slew of other items. While in my mind, I had established a definition of resilience that matched my worldview, the people I was trying to connect with had a very different definition of resilience, which didn't include worrying about if they had enough batteries or food to make it through a large-scale disaster. Their idea of resilience was as simple as being able to make it through the day or even to their next meal or the next meal for their kids. So obviously then, as someone who's trying to connect with people who have a very different life experience than mine and a different perception of what being resilient means, then these emergency kits I've been preaching about were clearly not an equitable solution for the diverse populations of the city. And over the last several years, I've had many more of these moments. I've actually been at reception centers on more than one occasion that we've opened in the middle of the night for people who've been evacuated from their homes due to different types of emergencies, where I've actually recognized some of those people who've now lost their homes from emergency preparedness presentations that I had previously given. So when I'm seeing a person trying to sleep in a Canadian Red Cross cot in a gymnasium who I had given a presentation on emergency preparedness to, you really start to question how useful that cookie cutter information we provided to people really was. And I know I'm not the first person who works in emergency management to realize that the cornerstones of our emergency preparedness messaging are not equitable or inclusive. And to pick on 72-hour emergency kits again as an example, there's a certain subset of the population who can afford the resources required to be self-sufficient during an emergency for 72 hours. What I've found in my professional experience, though, is that this subset of the population don't take the time to prepare these emergency kits because most of the time they don't even really need to. During an emergency, this group of people generally have the means to support themselves relatively well without emergency kits because they have other tangible and less tangible resources like money, insurance, personal transportation, and a social network of individuals within a generally similar milieu. So I think the problem here is that we as emergency managers are focusing and targeting all of our messaging towards a demographic for which the information isn't all that helpful. By focusing all of our efforts on this group of people, we're failing to consider the other members of our communities, those who don't have the same access to resources and social capital as other members of our population, who are really the ones we should be focusing on the most. And the constant promotion of emergency kits is just one fairly elementary example of emergency management not being equitable and inclusive. But I think it's a salient example and is reflective of some of the other experiences I've had during my working career, which have made me realize that this is much more of a systemic issue. So having these realizations has made me incredibly aware that despite my degrees and work experience in emergency management, I cannot consider myself as an expert on all of the different diverse communities within the city, let alone consider myself to be in a position to tell them what they need to do to be resilient. So this is when I really started changing how I approach things when working with the different people who live in Mississauga. The first step to this was to understanding that I'm not in a position to tell people what they need to do to be resilient, but instead, I need to find out from them what they need based on their own unique experiences and life context to be resilient. So what we started to do from this point on when engaging with the different groups in our community was to change the way in which we engage with people away from a presentation instruction type approach to more of an open forum and discussion to really learn about these different communities, their experiences and challenges during emergencies and disasters, and how we at the city might be able to support them during these types of events. And the feedback we started to receive during these sessions was incredible. People from these communities really started opening up about their own experiences and opinions, and often their statements would start with something like, where we're from, or for people like us, or at my age, Where we're from, people don't have good experiences with the authorities when they call 911. So it's not what we think to do during an emergency. In our country, we deal with emergencies ourselves and we don't rely on the firefighters or police. For people living with my disability, it's very difficult to leave my home if there's an emergency. And after hearing all of this amazing insight into these communities, even though it went against everything I thought I knew, I realized that my role as an emergency manager was not to be the authority and know-it-all in emergency preparedness and resilience, but it was to support these diverse communities in driving resilience building efforts that were equitable, inclusive, and most importantly, meaningful for the specific needs in their communities. So to demonstrate how we're thinking of putting some of this into tangible action, I want to share with you an example of something that we're in the very early stages of working on in the city. One of the action items from the city's climate change action plan was to develop resilience hubs to establish a center for climate change and disaster resilience related training programs, information, tools, and networks. This project was paused, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but last spring I started working with our environment and climate change team to embark on the long planning process for this program. And at the very beginning, just like everything else, we tried to think about what we could offer through these hubs on our own. We thought about programming and information and training that we thought should be included in what our ideas of a resilience hub should be. But as we took a moment to pause when doing our initial research, we realized that we were falling into the same old pattern and mindset of trying to be saviors of these communities. Fortunately, we've been able to connect with representatives from different municipalities from across North America who are in the planning or implementation stages of their own resilience hubs, who have been very generous to share their experiences with us, and we are extremely grateful to them for that. I was recently speaking with the Chief Resilience Officer of one of these cities who provided an absolutely incredible amount of knowledge and perspective on resilience hubs and community resilience in general. And one of the many things he said that really struck me was that if we try to implement something within a community without having first engaged and consulted with that community to understand their opinions, perspectives, and needs, that community is more than likely going to not only reject whatever we try to force into their community, but it can also exacerbate the division of trust between that community and the local government. So like I said, we paused and realized that if we want to foster community resilience, we need to make sure that these resilience hubs are community informed and community driven. And I think this concept was very well captured by a research team at the University of Michigan who found that in order to foster community resilience through resilience hubs, it is essential to have a participatory research design that iteratively seeks feedback from the broader community before moving forward with any one set of recommendations for establishing community resilience, equitably placing community voices at the forefront of hub planning. And as we've been starting to create our engagement plan and begin to engage with our different community members, we've really begun to understand just how many different organizations there are in the city who are passionate and committed to equitable and inclusive resilience in their communities. And many of them have already been working for years on exactly what we're trying to accomplish. For instance, the Citizens for the Advancement of Community Development, an organization who works to provide opportunities for BIPOC youth, hosted a forum in one of our community centers this summer to discuss issues and barriers that BIPOC youth face, as well as potential solutions. Another example is the PAC Pioneers Community Organization of Canada, who meet every week in one of our community centers, with their primary focus being to offer services to South Asian seniors who experience isolation and loneliness. And although some of these groups and the issues they look to tackle might not be directly related to emergency preparedness in the traditional sense, especially as it relates to developing an emergency plan and having an emergency kit, the strengthening of social capital within these groups and their ability to mobilize to take action against the various social vulnerabilities that they face aligns with what their idea of resilience is. And that is exactly the kind of resilience that will also help them during climate change related and other emergencies and disasters as well. So you're probably wondering, well, then what do we see our role being in this? And I recently had a conversation with a very motivated and intelligent leader within the city's faith-based community who said, Ben, we don't need someone from the city to tell us what to do. We just need someone to facilitate it all. So that's exactly what I think we're aiming to do. Of course, we'll offer programming and services related to climate change and emergency preparedness as the demand for it arises. But I think our main role will really be as the facilitators, connecting this broader resilience community to the right information, resources, and social capital that they need. So to use some terms from Daniel P. Aldrich in his 2012 book, Building Resilience, Social Capital in Post-Disaster Recovery, what we're essentially trying to do in our facilitator role through these resilience hubs is, first, support the ability of our different community groups to strengthen their bonding social capital, or the strength of their connections within their own existing community through supporting their ability to host forums and events and provide information and resources to their community. As I mentioned, there are already many dedicated groups within Mississauga who are hosting these types of events and forums on a weekly basis. So we at the city need to ensure that these groups have the resources and support that they need to keep doing this kind of work, and that other groups who are interested in doing this as well have the resources and support to do it. Secondly, we want to facilitate the bridging social capital between different community groups, especially those that provide different types of services and support different segments of the population. So we can connect these groups to facilitate a broader level of information and resource sharing amongst community members and neighbors, especially during disasters. So essentially, we're looking at how we can connect different groups throughout the city who are already in the business of resilience and goodwill and create a network of knowledge and resource sharing amongst these groups. And then finally, we want to create that linking social capital between our diverse communities and ourselves within the local government, as well as some of our partners from other levels of government, NGOs, etc., to ensure that we are always connected to our communities and are able to support them as we foster resilience together. By no means does this entail telling these groups what to do to be resilient. Instead, this should just be ensuring that there's always that conduit between our communities who are already doing such great work at the community level with us in local government, so that we can hear directly from our community members about what they need to ensure resilience before, during, and after disasters. So as I mentioned, we're still in the very early stages of this Resilience Hub project. As of right now, it looks like this is something we're going to implement first as a pilot project in a specific area of the city, as opposed to a blanket approach across the city. And as you can imagine, we are delivering this as a pilot project because we want to make sure that these resilience hubs are community driven, and ensuring we are hearing the voices of all of our community in just one area of the city is quite an endeavor, let alone ensuring we're hearing these voices from neighborhoods across all areas of the city. But although this can seem like an enormous undertaking, it really is quite simple for reasons that I've already mentioned. You see, as we've begun planning for these resilience hubs, not only are we engaging with our local community, but as mentioned, we've been very fortunate to have met with representatives from several cities located across Canada and the United States who are working on the concept of resilience hubs themselves. These cities have been incredibly gracious to share their experiences with us, and many, if not all of them, agree on the same thing. And that is that these different community groups and networks exist with or without our support. These groups will open their doors to their communities during emergencies and share resources and information with each other, regardless of whether we as a city are there with an official Resilience Hubs program or not. These groups already have their own definitions of what resilience is, unique to their community, and they already know the best ways based on their own unique ethnic, religious, cultural, or other life circumstances to foster this resilience. Like I mentioned earlier, these groups don't need us to do a whole lot for them. They just need us to be there to support them, foster those connections and different types of social capital, and facilitate the coordination of the individual efforts of all of these groups across the broader city. So reflecting on my experiences, not only with our Resilience Hubs project, but also just my experiences in emergency management, working with this diverse communities in general, I've learned several lessons. The first is that as local emergency managers at the municipal level, we often believe that we don't receive the support we need from higher levels of government to foster resilience within our own communities. How can we as municipal emergency managers ensure resilience at the local level while also trying to align ourselves with the higher orders of government, all of whom are preaching the same things, emergency plans and emergency kits, without truly understanding what's going on in our communities? And I think there is some validity to this. I think that as the organizations that set the tone for emergency management in Canada, the federal and provincial emergency management bodies within Canada need to promote emergency preparedness and resilience measures that are both meaningful and flexible to local communities. As opposed to standardized emergency preparedness advice that falls short for most, federal and provincial emergency management bodies should be developing customizable resilience resources that can be adaptable by most communities, regardless of their makeup. However, shifting the responsibility of community resilience to the federal and provincial levels of government is an obviously poor solution to building community resilience. Community resilience is something that is inherently a bottom-up, locally driven process. As I've been alluding to and mentioning throughout this presentation, as soon as we try to impose top-down, government-driven programs into our communities, they're bound to fail. Federal public administrators cannot possibly be the experts on each of the unique communities that exist throughout the country. And I think that local emergency managers are in no position to criticize the emergency managers in higher levels of government if they themselves aren't connected with the local communities that they work for. So while I believe that there is a responsibility of federal and provincial governments to set the tone of emergency preparedness and resilience through flexible, meaningful, and new contemporary approaches to these issues, I believe the real onus falls on the emergency managers at the local level, like myself. As a municipal emergency manager, I feel extremely lucky that I have the opportunity to work with local communities on a daily basis. I truly have my finger on the pulse of so many different issues and things that are going on at the local level, and there are really very few hurdles or bureaucratic processes that I have to jump through if I want to work directly with a community group. But the thing is, just because I have this opportunity working in municipal government doesn't mean I automatically get to capitalize and reap the benefits of it. If I, as a local emergency manager, want to foster resilience within my community, I have to get out into the community and make the effort to do so. It's very easy for me to set up a booth in the mall every emergency preparedness week and tell people about the importance of emergency kits, but this isn't an equitable, inclusive, or even quite frankly, a very worthwhile and beneficial effort. It's even easier to sit in my home office and work on another emergency plan, exercise, training session, or one of the endless other tasks that most of us in emergency management spend the vast majority of our time on behind a computer screen. And while all of these tasks are important and are essential to our job, if I want to foster community resilience, I need to actually get out into the community and learn directly from these local community members about their diverse situations, experiences, and needs. And that's not something I can always do from behind a computer screen. And I can already hear the feedback from my fellow municipal emergency managers who are probably asking me right now, where do you expect us to find the time and the resources to do all of that? Most municipal emergency managers already have so much on their plates between all of the different legislatively required items and other things that are imposed on them that it's difficult to find the time to actually get out in the community and embark on community-focused resilience initiatives. And that is totally fair. There are only so many resources local emergency managers have at their disposal, and these resources need to be allocated appropriately. But if there are just a couple more pieces of advice I could give to my fellow municipal emergency managers based on my experience, it would be these. First, if you're looking for more support and potentially more resources from your internal leadership teams, my experiences has generally been that public-facing, community-oriented programs and projects are usually the way to go. The senior leaders within your organization are constantly sitting through your program committee meetings, reviewing and approving the same emergency plans, attending your exercises and training sessions year after year, and generally seeing another iteration of the same things on repeat. And while this type of organizational corporate preparedness work is essential, I find that we as emergency managers place way too much of an emphasis on it to the point where it isn't balanced proportionately with the community building resilience work that we could be doing. This then becomes repetitive and stale for senior leaders. However, in my experience, local governments are always very willing to support initiatives that actually get the organization out into the community working with the public. The whole point of government and public administration is to serve the public. So any program where public servants are working directly with the public and making immediate impacts on their situations have always been fairly well supported in my experience, as long as those tangible benefits are there. And there's a wide range of evidence-based research that supports the notion that building and fostering social capital in our communities improves resilience during and following disasters. And this ties into the final point I'll make, that the effort that is put into supporting local communities is worth it. And I know this type of work takes a lot of effort. Like I already mentioned, it would be much easier for me to sit in front of my computer in my air-conditioned office, put in my 8 hours and clock out every day. Taking the time to drive out to all areas of the city at all hours of the day and meet with various different community groups takes up much more of my time and effort. But I believe that this work is worthwhile and is worthy of this effort. While the plans and exercises we work on are all great, they're meaningless if our communities aren't resilient themselves. So in order to foster this resilience, we need to take the time and effort to work closely with our local communities, implementing and supporting equitable and inclusive measures based on the diverse needs of the community. And these are not what we think they need. We need to work closely with these community groups, really listen to what they have to say, and meet their needs based on what we hear from them. So in closing, I would say take the time and the effort to get to know the diverse community groups and community members within your local area. While it may not always seem like traditional emergency management work, playing ping pong with the members of a local business association, eating cake with a local seniors group, or playing trivia with teenage environmentalists, all of which are just a few examples of things I've actually gotten to do in my job, allow you to really get to know the different groups in your community. And understanding the unique needs of these communities is the vital first step in ensuring that you as an emergency manager can empower these communities to foster equitable and inclusive resilience in their communities. And it can also be a lot of fun. So thank you very much, everyone. That is my presentation for today. I've left my contact information on the screen here. I know a lot of what I talked about today could probably use some additional context, and that might not fit within a 30-minute presentation, but I'm sure we'll be able to have some questions at the end to maybe discuss a bit more of it in depth. But even beyond that, feel free to reach out to me anytime, and I'm happy to kind of talk about anything I talked about today a bit more, and maybe provide a bit more context to some of the stuff that I only had so much time to work with for one presentation. So thank you so much. And I really appreciate being able to speak with all of you today.
Thanks very much, Ben. This was great. I really appreciate the humanistic approach to emergency management expertise that you've described. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind for everyone in this field who are trained to speak and be experts. I really appreciate your bringing that to light. There are a couple of questions for you in the chat. You're welcome to answer those in the Q&A itself, or wait till the end. I'm happy to direct them back to you. Okay. In the meantime, I'd like to get started with Linnea Warren. Linnea is going to talk to us about measuring equity in the context of disaster resilience and response. Please, Linnea.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Let me get my screen shared. And let me know if you can't see my slides. All right, so thanks so much for the introduction earlier. I'm Linnea Warren. I'm a policy researcher at RAND, and my research interests touch on topics related to community resilience and health equity, including the disaster response context. So I'm super excited to be part of this speaker series. Just to describe my positionality a bit at the outset of my talk, I am coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Osage, and Shawnee peoples. I bring the perspective of a white female researcher in my 30s. I work primarily in a domestic US context, and I'm really aware of the privileges and limitations that my life and professional experiences afford me. And I do want to lead off with humility and acknowledge the limitations of some of those aspects of my perspective. I also mostly work out of an office in front of a computer, which will become clear as I walk through this presentation, which is a bit more, I guess we'll say, theoretical than what Ben shared from his personal experience working in emergency management. So just as a quick overview of my talk today, I'll focus on a couple of main points: framing equity concepts and measurement, including the parameters of equity and distinctions between social vulnerability and equity; various pros and cons of existing measures of equity in the disaster context; and finally, just a little bit of some exciting emerging methods and measurement that better consider equity principles. As a quick caveat, for those who joined today hoping for me to tell you exactly which measures and data you should be using to assess equity, I'm sorry, I won't be doing that. Instead, I'm going to take sort of a philosophical approach, discussing how to set up your research questions and approach with some examples of current methods and promising emerging approaches. So the key is that I can't tell you what to use to measure, but instead how to decide what to use to measure and what to think about. I do also want to acknowledge my colleague at RAND, Dr. Melissa Finucane, who has led much of the work that I'm going to share today, including lead authoring the report that this talk is based on. And I'm happy to share a link to that report in the chat if folks are interested and you don't receive it otherwise. Oops, went a little ahead. Okay, so key takeaways, for those of you who just want me to cut to the chase, you can expect me to talk about equity as a major goal of disaster resilience, response, and recovery. Increasingly, federal and local decision makers are interested in measuring the impacts of federal disaster programs on equitable recovery. But equity is a very complex and multidimensional construct. And to date, much of the focus has been on defining and measuring equality or social vulnerability, even if labeled as equity measurement. And there are ways to measure disaster impacts that better attend to equity than most of the commonly used measures. And finally, this talk should really help you think about how to develop a systematic and robust approach to measuring equity. So recent headlines and new commitments have shown that equity really is becoming a major and explicit goal of disaster resilience, response, and recovery. And these screenshots are from the US context, but many of these principles still apply internationally. But the question for agencies now is how to balance sort of their standard approaches to risk assessment with those that help them meet their broadly defined equity goals. So as you may or may not know, technical risk assessments for determining disaster assistance have been developed and refined over several decades. But most risk assessment approaches focus on damages to property assets. And so have ended up overwhelmingly weighting wealthy individuals or areas when determining vulnerability and need. So in short, you have to have significant assets to be counted as part of this process. And as a result, these approaches tend to overlook poor people and poor communities. But there really is a large literature that has been developed more recently that highlights the important role of socio-demographic factors that affect disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. There's an emerging interest in mechanisms or tools like differential cost sharing that could offset some of the wealth bias that has been baked into the traditional assessment and cost benefit analysis methods. So consequently, what we're trying to do now is figure out equity standards or outcomes and evaluation processes to determine both what the baseline conditions are, what our goals are, and how to get there via disaster assistance provided by government entities or others. So what is equity? This speaker series is titled Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Disaster and Emergency Management. So I hope I'm not the first to raise this question with this audience. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these visuals that attempt to define equity and differentiate it from equality. So in terms of processes, these visuals kind of show the same things. Equality means that each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. And equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the resources and opportunities needed to strive to reach an equal outcome. But I've always struggled with these visuals because they really don't help us understand what we should be measuring when it comes to equity if we're interested in measuring the equity outcomes of our processes. So I thought it could be useful to share a quick primer about equity and equity concepts, since there are multiple approaches to defining it. So here I'm going to use a framework from McDermott and colleagues in 2013 that they developed in the context of ecosystem service markets, but it is pretty generalizable across contexts. So they define equity by evaluating the change in the relative situation of particular groups in society. So while you might think about justice as about rights, equity is really a comparative construct, and it's primarily concerned with relationships between people and their relative circumstances. So there are three main dimensions that form the content or the what of equity, and together these dimensions characterize the subject matter of equity as explicitly or even implicitly defined in policies, projects, or plans. So the first dimension is what we call contextual equity. And these are the historical forces that create an uneven playing field from the outset. So the extent to which pre-existing political or socioeconomic conditions might limit or enable people's capacity to engage in or benefit from resource distributions. The second dimension is what we call procedural equity, which reflects the decision-making processes or rules and the extent to which the processes recognize different groups to ensure that they're included or represented in those processes. And then the third dimension is called distributional equity, which refers to how the costs, risks, and benefits are allocated and distributed across society. And there are several different principles of distributional equity. So for instance, there's equality, which targets an equal distribution of costs and benefits across the community. There's a principle of social welfare, whereby we maximize net social benefits and share profits across community members. There's a merit principle, which rewards disproportionate input or effort or accomplishment. And then there's the need principle of distribution, where benefits specifically are designed to improve the welfare of the least advantaged or the most marginalized in communities. So for those of you who are familiar with some equity evaluation approaches or methods, you might already be kind of imagining where the measures you know about might slot into this sort of framework. So those three dimensions form the content or the what of equity. And how these dimensions are shaped depends a lot on the other questions that kind of frame the whole equity problem, if you will. So one of these questions is who counts as a subject of equity? Who is the target group? And at what scale are we talking about? There's also questions about why are we interested in equity or not? Are we just trying to do no harm? Are we trying to ensure no one is made worse off? Or are we actually trying to advance equity, that is, move toward a situation where there's more equity across groups? So how the parameters, the what, who, and why of equity are determined will have a big influence on what is measured and concluded about equity progress and outcomes. Now would be a good time to differentiate equity from the concept of social vulnerability, which will be important when we start discussing some of the available measures in the disaster resilience and response context. Social vulnerability reflects combinations of socioeconomic and other processes and conditions that shape people's ability to withstand and recover from stresses or shocks or disasters. Equity, you'll recall, is a comparative construct. So it's characterized by broad perceptions of fairness across different groups. And it allows for unequal distribution of benefits and costs with the goal of net social gain. So another goal is fair access to livelihood, education, and other resources such that race and gender or other demographic characteristics don't impact the distribution of opportunity. So in the context of extreme events, equity means that socio-demographic characteristics like race or gender or age or anything else predict the distribution of disaster aid only to the extent that these things are related to the need for aid. One step in the approach of centering equity rather than social vulnerability is moving from approaches that attempt to classify people as inherently vulnerable to critically evaluate those processes that generate vulnerability. So the assumption within the social vulnerability approach are that disadvantaged or underserved communities are inherently vulnerable. And the focus on people's status as vulnerable has sort of obscured the policies and programs that have perpetuated racism and classism, often called systemic inequities, instead putting the burden on those disadvantaged communities to prove that they have experienced some sort of material discrimination or harm. And work from environmental justice scholars has attempted to kind of shift the focus from vulnerable populations to policy and planning processes that generate vulnerability, called procedural vulnerability. So in the spirit of considering processes as a critical aspect of the measurement equation, I now want to introduce a tool that is useful to understand the types of information needed to robustly measure equity. So for assessing equity performance, that is whether a grant or a program or another activity increase or decrease equity over time, we need an evaluation model to structure these assessments of where the highest areas of need are targeted adequately by the funding. So this type of action logic model is helpful to highlight the logical relationships between program components and their intended outcomes. And this type of approach is probably familiar to those with training or experience in program evaluation. So you also know from a measurement perspective, developing a logic model is a critical step to creating a robust and comprehensive approach to selecting measures and identifying what data to use. So let's dig a little bit deeper on the application of a logic model to understanding which program components have what equity impacts. So the starting point is really the context in which equity is being assessed. So this is sort of the legislative mandates, executive orders, or other guidelines that are available to inform the inputs. For instance, the amount of resources that, or the target that a particular program is focused on. So we need to understand the inputs, the resources that we have to build capacity toward equity in the long term. So in the context of a disaster aid program, this could be the funding or existing research available on the topic. But really, a lot of our work focuses on the outputs, that is, the activities that are conducted by a program, as well as the participation of specific equity targets or target audiences of that program. So the outputs essentially describe what a program or a plan or an activity does with the resources available through the inputs to direct the course of change for a particular group. So for instance, when a notice of funding opportunity is released, it will specify sort of the technical and qualitative criteria for getting that funding. Like you need to provide different levels of cost share for different types of activities or different types of beneficiaries. A program might also specify that it's particularly interested in supporting projects that are aimed at different areas defined in different ways. They might define economically disadvantaged rural communities, for example, as a particularly important group toward which resources should be allocated. And then ultimately, impacts or outcomes and impacts, which can be collapsed into one bucket or split out into separate buckets that would be expected to be achieved in the short, medium, and long terms. In terms of equity outcomes, we've already talked a little bit about the different dimensions of equity potentially being affected. So for our example of a higher federal cost share going to an economically disadvantaged rural community, the expectation is that we would achieve distributional equity in that a higher proportion of the funding would go to communities with less resources to attempt to even out the resources available across different types of communities. And then finally, in terms of impacts, there's actually, I think, a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding and defining and measuring what it means to achieve something like equitable risk reduction. So I've inserted some suggestions here about reducing susceptibility to future disasters and improving coping and adaptive capacity, but there's certainly a lot we need to do to build out this bucket. Always as part of action logic models, which isn't actually shown here, but we have certain assumptions or external factors that are kind of floating around in the background that also should probably be measured, but I won't be talking about those today. We're really just focused on kind of the guts of the logic model. The central points or buckets of inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So let's turn now to a question that seems to be on everybody's mind, and that is equity for whom? So this has become increasingly topical since policymakers are really desperately trying to figure out, just how to identify who they want to target, especially initiatives such as the Justice 40 initiative, established through one of President Biden's executive orders, asks US federal government agencies or departments to identify underserved, vulnerable, or other variously termed communities that they should be targeting with the resources that they have and the activities they're conducting. So various terms have been used historically, such as disadvantaged, underserved, vulnerable, but exactly what people have meant by these terms varied. So I do want to talk a little bit more about potential target groups and how they have been or could be identified. So historically, vulnerable groups have been defined in multiple ways. I mentioned already economically disadvantaged rural communities, which emphasizes population, income, geography, kind of all in one. But other agencies and programs have focused on other definitions. For example, trying to address areas with high poverty or unemployment, as would be targeted in opportunity zones, or in terms of population density, kind of thinking about the urban-rural divide, or housing overcrowding, or incidence of disease or adverse health conditions. And then more recently, disaster and social vulnerability researchers have really led the charge expanding these variables or factors that are being considered in identifying vulnerable or underserved areas and communities. They've introduced other socio-demographic variables, and this has gotten to be a very big set recently. So just for instance, including people with disabilities, certainly talking about race and ethnicity, age, language competency, home ownership, and so on. This set has really expanded exponentially. So an attempt to sort of simplify the use of all of these variables, indexes of social vulnerability have been become increasingly common. Many of them actually labeled as equity tools, which can be confusing given the distinction between social vulnerability and equity that I previously described. So one example is the US Environmental Protection Agency's EJ screen, which is short for Environmental Justice Screen, which includes a demographic index. And this is actually one of the sort of simplest examples I've been able to find. The EPA's EJ screen is really designed as a pre-decisional screening tool for understanding where the effects of existing pollution might be the greatest. So what they do in the demographic index part of the screening tool is combine two metrics that they think are good proxies for communities' health status and their potential susceptibility to pollution. And these two variables are percent minority and percent low income, which are drawn directly from the American Community Survey from the US Census at the census tract level. And they correlate with vulnerability and susceptibility. So the EPA is sort of making the case that simply taking an average of these two indicators is good for a first order determination of vulnerability or susceptibility to pollution. And I do think that's a good place to start because these are very general indicators of potential susceptibility and at the census block group level. So the data are relatively easy to obtain from the US Census. I could pull them off the internet right now. And the variables are correlated with factors related to increased susceptibility, like poor health status or reduced access to healthcare. The downside is that they ignore things like lack of resources or language skills or education that would help people to avoid exposure or obtain treatment. But these variables are also used by other federal programs. So we'll talk a little bit about the extension or inclusion of other variables in these efforts. But finally, let me say that the use of two variables in the demographic part of the EJ screen kind of avoids some of the challenges of more complex indexes, like the Social Vulnerability Index, either Susan Cutter's Social Vulnerability Index, the SOVI, or the SVI, which is also the Social Vulnerability Index, developed by the Centers for Disease Control. So some of you might be familiar with some of these indexes, and I think that they are important, and they're used by a variety of researchers in government and non-government organizations when comparing different geographic units in terms of their relative levels of vulnerability. They have some shared characteristics in that they all kind of represent latent constructs that are connected to vulnerability, not directly observable vulnerability. So they also have some limitations. So I want to emphasize a note of caution because none of these indexes have been definitively validated. And there's actually been some recent work that has shown that they aren't necessarily reliable as the data that feed into the index increases. There are different levels of vulnerability that are spit out at the end, basically. So I won't get into a lot of detail on their limitations, but I did want to raise those cautions because these are very commonly used measures currently. So now to get to, in terms of equity indicators and metrics, there are a variety of approaches that we uncovered in our review of existing equity indicators in the disaster context, which is the report that's cited at the bottom of this slide. Some focus on health, others on education or transportation or financial outcomes. Others have focused primarily or even exclusively on built or physical infrastructure or outcomes related to the natural environment. But to summarize the main findings of the review, there's really no one approach currently available that you can kind of just take off the shelf and use in a disaster context. If there was, this talk would be like 5 minutes long. But you could read the whole report for details. But to summarize some of the key findings, first, the indicators and metrics are often not specific to racial equity, which is incredibly important and certainly of growing interest. Different programs or organizations have different types of equity that they're interested in. And with the increasing focus on racial equity in particular, it's really highlighted the need for more disaggregated data or analytic techniques to help measure the differences of experiences with processes or outcomes by race. A second challenge is that different topics that are of interest to different groups, like stakeholders in health or education or transportation, or even electricity, food, you name it, will all have a different focus, and many of these are addressed at different geographic scales. For example, the health data are often reported at the county level in the US, while transportation networks are available at a much more granular scale. So when we try to sort of build up toward an overall equity index across all of these different sectors, different sets of indicators will have been combined in different ways. So it's really hard to kind of compare an index made by one group or sector for one locality with another developed for another. A third challenge is that oftentimes indicators are developed for theoretical purposes, and they haven't really been used in real world contexts. So they're kind of like, here's some of my recommendations about how to do this. And additionally, a lot of these indicators and metrics that have been used in a real world context were not developed for disaster situations. Another challenge is that the selection of indicators requires trade-offs. So balancing things like the validity or the reliability of a measure and the timeliness of the data that you can obtain and the available data that you have, or the utility of different spatial scales. And another challenge is that there are rarely criteria specified, transparently at least, for selecting data and balancing those trade-offs. And this is really important for providing context about the intended purpose for using that data or indicators, so that we really know that we're comparing apples to apples across different communities or geographies. And then finally, the appropriate measures of baseline conditions have often not been identified. So if we're talking about a change in situation, moving toward more equity, more equitable outcomes, we need to know where we're starting. And often those baseline conditions haven't been captured, even though they're very important. So now that we know about the limitations and considerations, how should you measure equity? Ultimately, equity indicators and metrics should be chosen based on the objective of the decision maker. So the choice of metrics might differ depending on the reason for measuring equity performance. So I'll just run through a few different reasons that might be motivating an interest in equity or the development of indicators and metrics. So for example, one reason for measuring equity performance might be that for the communication or engagement of stakeholders. So in this case, the focus is really on inviting discussion and generating buy-in and trying to sort of come to a shared vision. And in this case, equity indicators would probably need to cut across different sectors and different sectoral priorities. When the focus for measuring equity is primarily for deliberative planning or decision-making, I think the focus is more on goal setting or the mechanisms to achieve the goals or agency alignment. And in that case, the equity indicators would be to measure changes in the drivers of an equity. Another situation of equity performance measurement might be to justify investments. So, and the focus in this case is really on how investments would be spent and to what effect. And in this case, equity indicators need to capture different economic benefits, but also sort of broader non-economic benefits. When the purpose for measuring is for accountability or improving accountability and governance, the focus is on explaining efforts or accomplishments and progress toward goals. And in this case, I think we need baseline measures and certainly disaggregated measures along different socio-demographic lines. And unfortunately, this is going to rule out a lot of different indicators or measures just because the data aren't there to be able to do that. And finally, a reason for measuring equity performance might be to support learning and adaptive management. And so the focus here is really on monitoring and reviewing and evaluating outcomes of actions. So did this program really make a difference in the way that we expected? And also trying to identify failures. So in this case, we need indicators that tell us when something doesn't work and when the lessons that we might be able to learn from that, which can be politically awkward or damaging. And it's often not something that's very attractive to policymakers or practitioners, or at least their bosses in the real world. But it's certainly something that would help us move the field further in a more data-informed way. So again, ultimately, indicators and metrics need to be chosen based on the objective of the decision maker. And there are a lot of different legitimate reasons for choosing different indicators and metrics. So I want to diverge a little bit and talk about kind of an exciting area of research on measuring well-being losses following a disaster. So this is all to illustrate that the choice of metric to assess disaster impacts is extremely important. Standard approaches such as criteria for applying for government aid following a disaster measure asset losses, which are primarily based on damaged housing assets. And this really results in a biased representation of disaster consequences and emphasizes impacts on the wealthy in communities. So using a well-being loss as opposed to asset loss as a metric to assess disaster impacts provides more insight into the consequences of a disaster throughout the recovery process and also into the distribution of impacts over a broader population. So I'm going to talk about some really interesting work from researchers at Stanford and the World Bank that employs this approach. And I invite you to see Mark Vida et al. 2020. The citation is at the bottom of the slide for more detailed information on their methods and findings. But really at a high level, their measure of well-being loss incorporates housing asset loss, like the traditional approach, along with impacts on employment and income for households and supply chains for the larger economic system that result from the disaster. So I'm sure you can already kind of anticipate how conceptualizing loss more broadly is likely to better represent the true loss experience for the population. So to illustrate the application of this measure, imagine an earthquake along the Hayward Fault in California's San Francisco Bay Area. Impacted communities experiencing some degree of loss are shown in the map on the left in red. Following the earthquake, if we were to use the metric of housing asset losses, losses are primarily concentrated in communities that are falling closest to that fault line. And this is kind of shown in the chart to the right. The most affected cities in terms of housing asset losses, which is shown in those darker gray bars, would be Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco. At the household level, housing asset losses tend to increase with pre-disaster income because wealthier households tend to be homeowners with higher property values. So again, looking at the chart on the right, At the lighter gray bars, it's clear that well-being losses are more than double housing asset losses and really extend well beyond the areas that immediately surround the earthquake fault rupture. So Oakland and San Jose, you can see, are still among the most affected communities in terms of well-being losses. I put that little starburst there to signify those communities. But Hayward is now also among the communities with the highest losses. Comparing Hayward to Berkeley, which falls right above it on that bar chart, they suffer sort of comparable housing, asset, and employment income losses. However, Hayward experiences 2.5 times more overall well-being losses. And this stark difference can be partly explained by the difference in pre-disaster income in these communities. So Hayward's per capita income level is much lower than Berkeley's to start with, as well as access to savings, which is also much lower than Hayward and affects households' ability to recover. So this is a very brief summary of the very detailed methods that this group used to look at this problem, but it also shows how this very novel approach might be applied to a disaster context. And I hope it was helpful to kind of at least illustrate the implications of choosing the ways that you measure disaster impact and equity. You'll see that you would arrive at much different conclusions depending on the different approaches you use. So to summarize the main messages I covered today, there's really a need to develop a systematic and robust approach to measuring equity in the disaster and resilience context. This involves determining the parameters of equity you're interested in, the what, the who, the why, and also determining the purpose of equity measurement. Is it for agenda setting and communication, or monitoring and evaluation, or something else? And when it comes to determining measures to use, to employ a logic model to map out the possible metrics that touch on contextual, procedural, and distributional elements of equity. So in the disaster context, recognize both the importance of baseline characteristics of communities, as well as those processes that generate and perpetuate vulnerability. And finally, not to be overlooked, and something that relates to the concepts that Ben spoke to in much more detail, closely partnering with key stakeholders, including impacted communities, to develop measures really helps to better reflect on the ground realities. So I have a suggested reading list if you're interested in looking at more about some of the topics that I talked about today, including the various citations that were briefly mentioned on the slides. So you can return to this if helpful in the recording. Or you could reach out to me. I'll provide my email and I can share those citations with you, as well as a glossary of some of the terms I use. I used a little bit of jargon about measurement and equity, so maybe this will be useful as well. And then finally, like I said, my contact info, if you are interested in any follow-up or have any questions or would like access to the references, I'm happy to share. So with that, I think I will end, and I think we'll move into formal Q&A.
Thank you very much, Linnea. That was great. Again, as with Ben, I really appreciate that you took the time to break down what vulnerability is, to break down how we go about thinking about questions of equity. A lot of these things get lost when people look at large data sets or think about the metrics they want to use. So thank you very much for contextualizing that there are different questions being asked and therefore different metrics and processes are appropriate. So thanks very much. So with this, we're going to move on, as Linnea mentioned, we're going to move on to Q&A. We have about half an hour. And I want to make sure, so I have a few questions that I know were already asked on the Q&A. So if it's okay, I'm going to start with a question that was addressed to Ben. So Ben, the question was, how do emergency social services fit in with the municipal emergency management program that you've talked about? So if you wanted to touch on that for a bit, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. And we work very closely with our emergency social services folks. Usually the only time I see them though is at 2 a.m. after a fire, a flood, when I have to call them. So no, they're great. But so we work with them closely on a day-to-day basis in terms of kind of, I guess, what I was presenting on in terms of resilience hubs, but resilience, community resilience work in general. I, as an emergency manager, obviously have a very limited scope of expertise and knowledge. And so a lot of these community resilience building initiatives require kind of that broader knowledge base from all areas of the city or corporation. And so there's some obvious ones in that, like emergency management, sustainability, public health, emergency social services. But what we found too is a lot of this type of work has real benefits for some of the other departments that you might not think of traditionally. So does this kind of work maybe benefit your transit department or your works department or your libraries department, et cetera? So I think having a wide array of different kind of stakeholders who can contribute and benefit from this type of resilience work is beneficial. Obviously, for anyone who works in government knows that kind of the more people you add to something and the bigger you make something, the slower it gets and the bigger of a beast it is to manage. So that's why I think your resilience work program should be community led and community driven, and the city or the whatever organization it is there to kind of coordinate and facilitate things. And that work shouldn't hinge on the pace and the speed of the organization. And I know that's easier said than done sometimes, but I do think it is important to have those quarterly, monthly, whatever it is, check-in meetings with that broader group within your organization, who might not be who we traditionally think of, like I said, but who can benefit and contribute to this kind of work.
Thanks very much. So there's another question and it's a question that I want to put to both of you because I think it speaks to things that both of you have discussed. So the question originally was, so how do you ensure that city or municipal funding for resilience hubs how do you go about mentioning that that's equitably distributed, given that you're both recognizing in your own different ways how specific and contextualized the needs of people are across various communities? So how do you ensure that in terms of distribution and allocation of funding for these kinds of resilience hubs, that you're meeting people where they are, so to speak? So Linnea, if you want to start, and then I can come back to Ben.
Sure, maybe Ben can make it a little bit more real world, like I said. So I think from the measurement perspective, I would again kind of return to the logic model way of thinking about it. So thinking about, you know, the intended goal of the resilience hub, what is it intended to do, and sort of thinking about baseline characteristics. So kind of implied in that question is the idea of distributional equity. So making sure that you account for people's baseline conditions and then provide the resources needed to kind of level the playing field over time. But again, you know, theoretically, you can say, you know, we want to provide this level of resource, which we should expect to result in this leveling of some sort of like resilience, but, you know, the level of the community resilience. But again, it kind of comes down to, in practice, how do communities interact with those resources? Are they actually equitably available? Are people applying for them at the same levels? Which gets into sort of like the process and outputs components of the logic model. So again, I would kind of just return to the logic model and think through, you know, what are the resources available and how do you make sure that processes and outcomes are considered as part of that?
Great. So at the planning level, what you're taking us back to is this logic model that you were describing. So in general terms, in terms of designing what a resilience hub should be and how it should be directed at people, that's very helpful. Thank you. Ben, so if you want to talk a little bit more about your experience about how that works, how do people struggle to make it equitable?
To be honest, I was quite happy with deferring that to Linnea, just because that was a very interesting thing during her presentation. As I was trying to pay attention to the chat, but also watch, because that was super interesting as well. And just to give a bit of background, I think for resilience hubs, people get the resilient hubs in terms of having solar panels and generators and battery power and kind of the resilient infrastructure. And what we found, something that was really great when we were doing our consultations, is someone said that all of that infrastructure makes a facility resilient. It doesn't necessarily make that community resilient. And so I think that only having resilience hubs that have all of that infrastructure to them is fairly exclusive as well. And we need to be inclusive of those other organizations who don't have the funding or even physical locations of their own. And then in terms of actual funding, and again, I don't want to talk too much about our specific program because it's in the very early stages of development. And so a lot's going to change. But I'd be happy to talk to people about it offline. But what we found through our consultations was that most of the Resilience Hubs programs of the municipalities we talked to did not receive any municipal funding. They were entirely either grant or philanthropic funding. And so the municipality's role really was to kind of facilitate the grant funding, provide, connect different community groups to those funding, grant opportunities, help with the grant application process, et cetera. But I don't really have a great answer for how you would equitably make sure that those are distributed. And I think that was a really important thing that Linnea touched on. There's community groups that we work with in the city who have full-time staff and tons of resources. And then there's the corner church that doesn't have that same access to resources. So I think that's something, I'm glad I attended this session to be able to see Linnea speak, because I think that's something we need to take in consideration as we're developing this program and with all of the other community resilience work we're doing.
Thanks very much. Linnea, so this is a question specifically for you, I think. So how do you evaluate the equity index in relation to FEMA's national risk index? So I guess, how do these indices, how do you evaluate them together or against each other? How do they relate? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those who aren't familiar with FEMA's National Risk Index, so that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And basically what the National Risk Index does is kind of layer risk of various natural hazards with social vulnerability. So actually a lot of the stuff that I described about social vulnerability index is kind of layered into the National Risk Index. So the way that I would like to think about that is just sort of the different, getting back to that question of what is the purpose of equity measurement. So the National Risk Index is super helpful to say, like, where do we expect that there's communities that will be at higher risk for different natural disasters, wildfires, flooding? Where are there particular social vulnerabilities that might, based on how well they correlate with how people have responded to disasters in the past, that might put people at greater risk based on their social demographic characteristics and things like that. But again, that's all sort of, to me, describing the initial context, like where are people starting from? What is the potential that they would experience disaster loss? But it doesn't necessarily get into the question of processes. So, if they were to experience a loss, what is the likelihood that they would be able to benefit from a recovery program? What is the likelihood that they would be able to come back more resilient after a disaster? So if I were to think about an equity index or measurement process and a little bit more robustly, I would like to think about sort of the tail ends. Hopefully I'll stop talking about the logic model at some point, but I would think about those other buckets of the logic model and think about, if at the end of the day you're interested in people's relative positions in a community, how do the processes of getting aid even after a disaster, or getting mitigation funding or resilience funding to prepare for a disaster might help to get to a more equitable outcome in the end. So again, a useful tool, really helpful that it sort of layers the socio-demographic info with natural risks. But we need to think a little bit more deeply about those later parts of the model.
Thanks very much. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that from both of you and from some of the questions being asked, it seems that you agree that where people start is really important. What kinds of allocations, what kind of resources, what kind of community, social, cultural capital they have around them matters. So it's not like very often economic models in particular will use market methodology to say people can negotiate to get what they need. But what you're telling me is that once we read in race, class, gender, ethnicity, etc., the what people have before a disaster happens, how they live their normal life really matters. And so, particularly coming from a law and politics background, for me, a lot of this stuff is structured in. It's coded in by law. So it's not just it's accidental that some people live in particular places and don't have access to lighting or transportation. Right? So these are normal vulnerabilities that both through logic models and through community management and community interventions, you're trying to manage something called a disaster. But how do you both feel about being actors who don't play sort of law and policy roles yourselves? But how do you feel you're able to combat that kind of a structural sort of law and policy background conditions under which people normally live and exist? And I asked this, and I want to tie it to one of the questions being asked. The question being asked was, how do you use social and ethnic diversity that exists in the communities that you work with in non-preparedness phases? So in response and recovery, so if you could give me some thinking about how you locate people with their diversity inside the general sort of Western normative structure, and how you think that plays out in the after post-disaster phase. Any of those would be helpful. Thank you. Ben, I'll let you go first if you.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'd say, and I saw, I think the question in the chat about some of that as well. So I think the goal of kind of resilience in our resilience hubs is that it shouldn't just be a response phase thing. And ideally, this is an access to the community and the resilience building work that we do during response as well, absolutely, but in the preparedness phases and recovery phases as well. So before, during, and after emergencies, that is really vital. So providing those resources, connecting with those communities before emergencies and after emergencies, so they have the access to resources and information. I think one of our pie in the sky goals of our resilience work that we do is that hopefully if we can do all of that work and resilience building work in the before and after, people will require less support and less resources during the emergencies. And I know that's kind of a lofty goal, but I think if we can build that resilience through in blue sky non-emergency event or times, then that'll really strengthen our response. And like I mentioned in my presentation, that's kind of community driven and what their definition of resilience is to them. So it doesn't have to be emergencies and hazards and all that stuff. It could be workforce development, opportunities for BIPOC youth, etc. And so I think really it is just making sure you're inclusive and hearing those voices of your community.
Great, thanks. Linnea, did you have something you wanted to add to this? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, and I'll speak from kind of a researcher measurement perspective, and then maybe from more of like a policy decision maker's perspective to the extent that I can access that. So from the research perspective, I think a lot of what you're describing is just a matter of making that explicit, that that these conditions were not caused by accident, and that people are perpetually more vulnerable because of past historical policy decisions. And often those things have not been explicitly identified in a logic model or in a research plan. And so hopefully the ultimate goal of that is to kind of illuminate, okay, so if these are the explicit reasons why people are continually vulnerable, continually experiencing more harm from disasters, what is the solution? Well, implied there is that we've addressed some of those policy decisions from the past. So then pulling in the perspective of the policymaker, there are different approaches to addressing that problem, many more politically tractable than others. So it's not always possible to undo structural policy decisions, but some communities are. They are saying like we are going to kind of take a look at our zoning decisions and reframe those and redo our whole zoning plan to try to redress some of the problems that caused initially. Others are continually kind of gap closing, saying like we know that those decisions were made, people have been harmed, and we will do our best to try to support vulnerable communities through additional programming, through additional resources. But we know that's always kind of in the background. So it's a very hard question. And I appreciate people raising that, because I think that we will continually be up against this question of, why are people vulnerable until we address those kind of baseline conditions that brought them there.
Great, thanks very much. One other question that I have in front of me is that, so what's the impact of digitization? How does that influence your ability, both in modeling and in thinking of doing community work? How does that influence fostering inclusivity in the community and resilience hubs? And how does it affect equity measurements for you, Linnea? Ben, if you'd like to go first, or I'm happy for you to.
Sure, it does. I'm happy to go first. And there's a lot of smart people in this presentation asking really smart questions. So this is great. And I think in terms of digitalization, I guess from just thinking about it and what we've done so far, using some of, like Linnea was sharing, some of the risk vulnerability mapping is something that we use a ton of in terms of where are our different vulnerable communities, and is that across all types of different kind of indicators for vulnerability. So we've mapped things like heat islands in the city, tree canopy cover, income levels, newcomers to Canada, etc. And so having some of those different tools and resources like dashboards and tools that kind of make sense of data and show some of that stuff can really help us identify where some of those most vulnerable communities are, who are we reaching, who are we not reaching, and where are some of the gaps in the work we're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say I'm glad that Ben described how he kind of uses those tools, because I'm always curious. Like, I'm interested in them from a researcher perspective, but I'm like, do people on the ground actually use these, and are they helpful? So I think that, yeah, the idea that more data are being made available publicly, are being kind of layered in user-friendly tools, is really great for people to make decisions to allocate resources. Though that, again, brings up kind of the question of capacity and who has access to those tools. Whether it be access to the internet, period, or the skills to use the tools, the skills to apply them to their decisions. So, you know, it's really exciting when localities are able to do that, but understanding that's incredibly variable at the decision maker level, not to mention at the resident level. So if the goal is to kind of communicate why you're choosing to put resources in certain areas, or why you're choosing to prioritize certain programs, there needs to be that kind of translation piece to help people who may not have access to the data themselves or be able to understand the data themselves, the rationale for all of that. So again, it kind of comes back to like, what's the point? What are you using the data sets for? And how do you communicate about that?
Great. Thanks very much. Any other questions that anyone else has? Otherwise, I have tons of questions. I perpetually wanted to ask people who do this work questions that only they, I feel, can help me with. So any other questions, anyone? So I have a question about, so fine, whatever, with you people attending, we're not asking more important questions. I'm going to ask one of mine. So both in terms of practicing this kind of work in communities and in terms of thinking about how to logically structure and model a response, or to even model what the disaster is or what vulnerabilities are, how do you, so a lot of the people who are vulnerable are people who are often in Canada, are often migrant communities or immigrant communities, right? And in the US, there are often people that are historically, socially, culturally, economically marginalized. Now, what these groups both have in common, whether they're citizens of the country or whether they're foreigners who settled here, is that they lack that their history is all new. In the US, that history is completely missing for these communities because they've just been not looked at for a long time. And you have questions about immigrants who move here who then don't have a history in Canada. How do you, Linnea, in your case, how do you model for that? How do you try to include that in data that can inform people? And Benjamin, I guess some of this you probably get from speaking to these people in communities and hearing their own stories as you were describing. But can you give us a more a global idea about to what extent disaster managers should be looking to understand and conceptualize history into their everyday practice, history of these communities in relation to the mainstream state in which they live? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer quickly because I think Ben probably again has something more interesting to say. But from my perspective, I think that introduces the importance of kind of mixed methods research. So not just looking at the data broken down by demographic characteristics, but doing qualitative interviews and talking to people and saying, like, how does your experience as an immigrant, as someone who's new to this community, affect your ability to connect with resources, affect your ability to know what to do in a disaster, affect your ability to connect with others in your community that can kind of provide that social capital, social cohesion that's so important in the case of a disaster. So I think that I wouldn't know from the outset like how to model it, because I would want to know what role their experience plays in how they interact with the emergency response disaster management system.
And I guess just my follow-up to that, Linnea, would be, so are these kinds of qualitative research, is this done? Is that factored in increasingly?
So it is done. It's resource intensive. So that's always the question. I think at least from our perspective, the work that I do at RAND, I myself am like more of a mixed methods person. So I love the opportunity to be able to do that. I think there is a very strong tendency to try to take a tool like a vulnerability index just off the shelf and say, we'll use this and this will help us figure out what to do. So I think it should be done more, but it's not completely, I think it's done a lot in like a research context, but maybe not as much like on the ground with some policymakers who are trying to make decisions.
Right. That's what I was wondering. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. Ben, nothing about you says off the shelf. So tell us, how does this work?
Yeah, I think Linnea made some great points there. And I think those qualitative kind of conversations we have with people is so helpful. So like I said, we've done consultations and engagements with our community partners, especially newcomers, and the feedback you get is incredible. In terms of, we talked to one group who they heard the fire alarm going in their building and they thought it was a bomb siren, so they all stayed inside and locked all the doors. But I think the challenge is we can't generalize newcomers either. So the experience of one set of newcomers and another set of newcomers, etc., they're all different. So I think it goes back to our challenge is really, how do we making sure we're hearing from everyone? So one newcomers group might have certain experiences, but others might have different experiences. And it is a huge undertaking to try to get to the feedback of everyone else as well, or everyone else. But we try our best, and we have methods that we're kind of working on to try to do that. But we don't want to have those out groups either, who are then, by not including in our resilience work, making them an out group and kind of isolating them more. And it's not really related, but I thought of it as well. And something I didn't really touch on in my presentation, but I think Linnea and I didn't really get into the scope of diversity, equity, inclusion in the profession of emergency management. But being kind of a white 30-year-old man with a shaved head, when I go into these communities wearing my city uniform with my ID badge, there's a certain level of trust sometimes. And so I think it's important, and again, this is kind of beyond the scope of what Linnea and I talked about, but giving the opportunity for these different groups to speak with people who have similar experiences and backgrounds as them is super helpful in kind of assessing what their actual needs and experiences are.
Great, thanks. And so just one other question to try and bring your and Linnea's work together. So as Linnea and you both mentioned, it says this work is resource intensive, right? It requires people with particular skills to be able to go out and ask these questions. My question then is, so with the information that you gather from different communities by doing this outreach work, by meeting them where they are there mechanisms by which this is being coded, by which this is being digitized so that it can be part of some kind of a larger structural logical planning mechanism? And you can keep adding and sort of mixing data within those larger sets, but is there work that happens to sort of make sure this data isn't lost, these information, these experiences, qualitatively sort of research, don't get lost but become part of the normal management process?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And like I said, we're kind of still in the early stages. And so we're still trying to kind of develop what our structure for this is. In short answer, yes, we do take that feedback and make sure we're kind of have a process to then incorporate it in the work that we're doing in the community. That's kind of the whole point of doing the engagements in the first place. So we do have a process for that, and we're working on that kind of process. And yeah, I think that's vital, and not only ensuring we're kind of, like you said, incorporating that, but then following up on that and evaluating that, and are the kind of actions we're taking, are they meeting those concerns or not? And so there's that constant feedback loop, that it doesn't just stop once we've implemented an action or a solution, but then going back to the community, doing more engagements and to see if we're being successful or not. And kind of how do we modify things from there?
Great. And so one other question that I see in the chat, and it speaks to what we've just been discussing. So how do you encourage participatory research in your case, Linnea? And I think you've talked more about this, Ben, about participatory governance, but I think the question speaks to how do you bring people in to be part of both the research side of things, but also the decision-making processes that are going to affect them? How do you make it more inclusive, not just in terms of their information and their knowledge as data, but their opinions and their ability to have a voice in what kinds of decisions are being made? Linnea, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly talk about sort of, the idea of, community-based participatory research and the importance of engaging communities earlier, sort of in the part of like formulating the question about like, why equity for whom? Because that will not only, help you understand what they're interested in learning about, and maybe they're not even interested in some of the same questions that you're interested in, but also kind of what are some of the best measurement approaches to use and data sets to use, and how they can be usable to community members later on. So it sounds a little bit obvious, but just helping community members not only be involved in the data collection part, like give us info about you, but the question formulation part, have them be part of the process of saying, like, this is the important aspects that we're interested in measuring. We would like to know more about, you know, how participatory the process is about, you know, applying for aid, how representative are people who are going out and getting and collecting information of the community. So again, it's just kind of like every step along the way, making sure that they're a part of that. And again, that speaks to the resource intensity of the work, if you're going to do it in a way that's really inclusive and equitable, but also the value, because if the whole point is to improve equity for a group, if that group is not part of it from the beginning, then you're not achieving your goal.
Great, thank you. And Ben, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I'll just quickly follow up, because I think my last answer too, I kind of tripped over my words in the process of how we actually do things. But I think the whole point of kind of the resilience work, what we do, is, like I mentioned in my presentation, it's community driven and community led. So we in the facilitator roles are kind of letting the community lead and drive this resilience work. And we kind of connect those different, ideally connect those different, have that network to connect information, resources, etc. So if one group says, we have this concern about this risk, we need someone in the business of food distribution. And if we've created that network where there's another group within that network who can kind of address some of those concerns, and another group who can address concerns here, it really is letting the community identify what are the issues they're concerned with. We as the city can hopefully then facilitate those conversations with the community, but it's really their solutions that they come up with and them driving the response to that. And we can just hopefully, if all is going well, facilitate that, provide them with the information and resources they need from a government perspective, but that let them really do the work that they're good at in terms of resilience and goodwill, and kind of support them more than hinder them if we can.
Great. Thank you both very, very much, Linnea. Ben, this has been an extremely rich and informative and extremely self-aware conversation about the needs of equity, diversity, and inclusion in disaster management. And thanks very much to people who are in the Q&A, who are the people in the audience. Thank you for your questions. I think we have some announcement to be made about future events for CIFAL, and I'm going to hand it over. Thanks very much, everyone.
Just to quickly wrap up, I think we're a little over time, but thank you again to Ben and Linnea for those great presentations. And thank you, Dr. Saptarishi, for moderating the session so well. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. And thank you also to all the audience members for participating in the Q&A and for being here for the presentations today. So I'm just sharing my screen to show the next session is going to be in 2 weeks from now. So Wednesday, October 19th, at the same time, from 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And our speakers for that session are going to be Chauncey Willis from the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, and Elaine Normand, who is a professor here at York University and is also the chair of the NGO Alliance and consulting associate for ADRA Canada. So those reminders will go out like normal to everyone who's registered for the sessions, but also just a reminder now for those of you who might be interested in these topics to put that in your calendar. And yeah, I think that's everything for the session today. So thank you again for everybody. And